Thanks for tuning in to Radio Free Pizza. Today I'm interviewing Indy, the co-founder of the Indie News Network, who recently wrote this origin story that really piqued my interest. So Indy, is there anything else that you'd like to add about yourself before we just get into it?
Yeah, just that, we met on Substack, I don't know, about a year or two ago, and I really enjoy Zaccaronia Pizza, and I appreciate the invite and the opportunity to share with your audience and the people who follow you all that we do over at INN. I know you've talked about us a little bit, but yeah, I'm excited to answer any questions and get into it for sure.
All right, wonderful. Well, explicitly in your origin story, I was curious about your experience with just becoming an anti-Zionist. I'm going to provide the link in the show notes, but just here it is, the particular section I'm talking about for anyone who wants to look it up soon. And so this basically covers your journey towards anti-Zionism from the perspective of somebody, or the background of someone who's culturally Jewish.
Yep.
So I need to be honest, I didn't even know that you were Jewish until earlier this year. There was a lot of complaints, not about you being Jewish, but about oh, this particular genocide is worse or better than this other particular genocide. And those kinds of, I want to just say, very weird value judgments as far as historical atrocities go. They interest me. And so I'm interested in particular with your journey towards anti-Zionism and more how it's been with you and in your life since that happened. So have there been any changes in your personal relationships, like with friends or family, since you became much more explicitly anti-Zionist?
I would say yes. A lot of the conversations that we end up having lead somehow to, well, this is because this is what Israel is doing, or people who are funded by Israel are doing, or what the motivation is behind a lot of this has religious overtones. So especially, a lot of my Jewish friends, it certainly has changed that relationship, and they, a lot of cases, we don't talk nearly as often or much at all, and it hasn't necessarily been a big confrontation at one time. It's more been a series of conversations over time where they've tried to kind of sway me away from the mindset and what I've been able to see. And once you see that, you kind of can't.
Try again.
You kind of. That was weird. My phone just decided to ask a question, but once you see that, you kind of can't unsee it. And so yes, it's changed my relationships in that a lot of the Jewish friends that I had before, especially the ones that are overtly religious and devout towards Israel, I don't really have much engagement with at this point, because it makes it really hard. I mean, I don't quite understand how anybody continues to watch what's happening and is okay with it. As a father,
Oh man. Yeah, and I have to say, not being Jewish, I can say that the same pretty much applies for most of the culturally Christian American friends that I have. It really leaves me dumbfounded a lot of the time. But in that case, I take it that among your generation, support for Israel is generally the same as it was for conservative Jewish generations past. Is that right?
I would guess, yeah. I mean, it's the default. There is no question, because it is the homeland that has been made out for the Jews, is the narrative that has been pushed out there. That's what I was raised under, and I didn't really know anything else. And we never talked about Palestinian people really, or why they were so angry, or what had happened to the land, or who was living there before 1948. They just talk about how basically everything started in 1948. We were gifted the land, and they don't go back to that timeline to really talk about how they got it and all of the the battles that happened in getting to where we were. It's go ahead.
I was just going to say that is kind of sad. Like, I also was pretty unaware of the timeline until I'd say in the past 2 years. Like, I had never heard of the Balfour Declaration, or in the last year, I'd only learned of the Havar Agreement and those sorts of things. And it's interesting, I guess, how that history has been kept from us, and how we're sort of made to believe, at least in mainstream media, that the Palestinians are simply all terrorists. And you don't even hear about terrorism from Zionists prior to 1948, like the bombing of the King David Hospital and that sort of thing.
Right.
Well, I'm so going back to just sort of how it is for you as an anti-Zionist in the Jewish community. Have you ever been accused of being a self-hating Jew? Has that come up?
I've heard the word thrown around a lot. I've seen it used to slur a lot of the people that I follow. Nobody's really called me that. Although I've had friends kind of joke with me that I'm a jihadist. I've had friends call me Hamas, as a joke, but not as like a real nasty, like, with vitriol and hatred, the way that you see Israelis have for Hamas. Remember that Hamas is also a political organization. They always use the argument about how they elected Hamas, except that half of the population is under the age of 18, and Hamas, they haven't even had an election since 2006. So how is it possible that they elected these people, quote unquote, when half the population wasn't even alive the last time they had an election? I just think that the whole conversation about it has been twisted in so many ways to rationalize murdering children. And that's what's been happening for every day now for 14 months plus. But before that, it had been happening pretty consistently. There are thousands of Palestinians that were locked up for no reason whatsoever, other than the fact that they looked funny at an agent, or that there was suspicion. A lot of the American Jews don't even realize about, like, the fact that an Israeli soldier can live inside, can basically quarter themselves inside a Palestinian's house and command them to stay. And a lot of the rules and the different streets that they're required to walk on, or the ones that they're not allowed to walk on. There's a lot there that Americans are not nearly aware of, that if they realize the kind of second-class citizens that the Palestinians were treated as, they would never tolerate it. But what they do is they turn a blind eye. They don't really want to pay attention to and learn the whole story. They want it gift wrapped and packaged by their government and by their media into, we're handling this, go back to watching Netflix and football.
Geez, yeah, there is a lot. Like, I wasn't even aware until you just said it, of an Israeli soldier being allowed to declare them, like, to quarter themselves in a Palestinian home. Like, I, as an American, I would be like, what about the Fourth Amendment? But obviously that doesn't apply here. Oh, man. Going back to just your relationship with the Jewish community, or more your observations of the Jewish community, I'm curious about the distinction between culturally Jewish and religiously Jewish. Do you believe that cultural Jews are more likely to be anti-Zionist? I'm asking because I follow the account @TorahJews on Twitter, and they are obviously, like, profoundly anti-Zionist, but I don't know if that image of most religious Jews applies.
I would say that they are the only organization that is that religious that I know of, that that devoutly religious and dedicated to the Torah, that is screaming about how this is anti-Torah and anti-Judaism, what they're doing and how they're trying to force their way into the land. That's not how the Torah said it was supposed to happen, that we were supposed to live in exile, and that there was a certain process and basically we haven't followed the process. It's really interesting though. I think that the cultural Jews. Now I got to explain this a little bit better.
Please.
The cultural Jews don't really go to temple very often. They use it's about literally culture. It's movies and the language and some bringing in some of the history, but for the most part, it's family and it's the different Jewish celebrating the different Jewish holidays in our way, like most of them. Passover. What we used to say was they tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. That was the cultural version of Passover. Now, when I was young, we used to sit down and do like a massive Seder with 30 people. We invited the neighbors and we invited strangers, and my father had business people come, and everyone would read a paragraph out of the book they called the Haggadah, and we would tell the story of Passover every year. That's what you're supposed to do. And what I've seen is that a lot of those traditions in a lot of ways have fallen off. There's a lot of fear in the American Jewish community about intermixing, about losing the identity, because there's a lot of intermarriage. And there's a lot of pushing on you see a lot of pushing on visiting Israel, on birthright, on connecting with other Jewish people. They want the Zionists specifically, all American, everything we've been subjected to our entire lives has been under the guise of Zionism. We don't even really understand what Judaism is outside of Zionism. So, because that's all that's been projected basically on this country from a media standpoint, from a synagogue standpoint. You walk into just about every synagogue in America, they are very pro-Israel, right? You see an Israeli flag right next to an American flag. Torah Jews wouldn't do that, right? You don't see very many temples that are dedicated to not being pro-Israel. And so I find that interesting also. It is, and look, 80% of Israeli Jews still support everything that's happening there. And it still just drives me crazy because they feel like it's a birthright. Like, wouldn't the Native Americans then have a birthright to the United States in the same way? And aren't we totally hypocritical in that? Of course we are. And it, God. So to get back to your original question, I think it would require the cultural Jews more. However, I think that it would be a lot more difficult to get them on board being anti-Israel because their identity has been so linked to Israel that it would be hard to extricate. Everything is built around next year in Israel, and when I was young, there was a focus and a push to try to convince me to visit Israel, and I did, and I was not comfortable there. 18-year-olds with machine guns strapped on their backs because of everyone's required to go into the military when they're 18, or you go to jail.
Jeez, this is interesting to me because the vibe that I'm getting from your description of just mandated support for Israel and the Jewish community, it seems like that is actually causing the erosion to some degree in terms of like observance of the actual religion. Am I getting the right impression?
I would say that's pretty accurate. But I would say that there isn't as much focus on teaching the religion as it is in wrapping it around Israel and what Israel does, and making sure that it's always got a link to Israel. Even a charitable fundraiser somehow will benefit and somehow will have a link and mention Israel. Even like no, it's amazing. It really is. And to be a part of the community, seeing it now for the last year and a half, as I have, because I still do. My kids still do go to Hebrew school. My wife is not where I am, so I've been, kind of dealing with that right in my own house, and that struggle. We really just don't talk about it much. I mean, we can't, and it's very painful for her. I get very aggressive and angry about it for sure, and because I see what's happening, and I could show footage on end, but she's got her whole viewpoint that I don't want to argue for her or about it here, but it's it is, and I've heard of families that have split over this, and I'm fighting very hard to make sure that does not happen with my own.
Well, God, I applaud that. I'm very sorry to hear about that for other families, and I certainly wish the opposite for yours. That's terrible.
Yeah, well, look at what's happening in our own country, even with people telling others to cancel relatives over Trumpers. It's very similar. Or look at Scientology, where the minute that people are not part of that world, they get extricated and excommunicated. Or the minute that they start to see some things that they don't like and start to ask questions, all of a sudden they're cast out and they're not really listened to. I mean, I have had a couple of conversations very briefly with a rabbi, a Zionist rabbi, about what's going on there and how can you be in support of this and what's happening there. And they just kind of shrug it off and say, this is what's supposed to happen. And this is what, this is our land. It was our land, and the 3,000 year argument just crumbles to me.
I can understand. It seems bizarre to me as an outsider because it's like, it sounds like you're thinking in terms of conquering the Canaanites or something like that. Like, it's a very bizarre kind of analogy to draw. But,
well, to ignore geopolitics and to ignore the Balfour Declaration and to ignore the U.S. interests in oil and gas in the region and in having a central hub to be able to conduct operations, a friendly central hub against a Middle East that we don't really understand or have very much connection to. To build that pipeline they're looking to now build, giving Turkey a piece of that. The Ben Gurion Canal. There are so many different components to why the United States has been helping, to why the United Kingdom has been helping, to why they built this in the first place and they carved this out in 1948 with the support of the Western world. And that's another misnomer that they never tell you, really, is that, of course, the United Nations, they approved and voted Israel in, but every Arab nation did not vote for that.
Yeah, that's true. I would have assumed, I guess, that they hadn't, but I've never heard that point made until now. Like, absolutely.
They're also members of the nation of community, and there was a holy site for them there. Mm-hmm. Israel, prior to that, Palestine was a non-secular place where you had Jews, Christians, and Muslims living alongside each other equally and in peace. And that I think at one point you might have asked like what do I see potentially a singular state that allows that for that to happen again. I don't know how we ever get there again, but that's the dream. That's the goal. That's what you have to try to put in place to have people live alongside each other in peace, side by side.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is a question that I've asked you outside of this recording, but it is something paramount and something that as much as one needs to be optimistic and hope for the best, it's very hard to see how that's going to come about. Like outside of the Jewish community, for example, this sort of the bleed over of simply ideology as opposed to looking at the reality of the geopolitics, the ideology of I'm going to speak just from the Western Christian perspective. There's a tremendous amount of guilt, I think, anyway, in most Western societies over having allowed the Holocaust to happen under Nazi Germany. And so, in that sense, it seems like the average American on the street, at least, just sort of thinks like, well, Israel needs to be allowed to do whatever it wants as a kind of penance for what the Nazis did. It's very hard to understand how two wrongs are allowed to make a right in within this pro-Zionist ideology that seems to dominate.
Well, number one, number two, never again. We were told never again, not just never again to us, but never again. Like we experienced this alleged, all of this firsthand stuff. The stories that we got, the people with the tattoos on their arms, and now they're digitally doing basically the same thing to the Palestinian people, almost like they used it as a model, which is beyond horrifying considering that the entire reason why Israel exists is because of what happened there. Does that mean that eventually they're going to carve out some other country and give it to the surviving Palestinian people and have them ethnically cleanse it for generations in order to have a homeland that they can call their own? I mean, the parallels are so weird, and the cognitive dissonance between not seeing what they're doing to the people. Now, what's even worse is the Germans, they were citizens, okay? Here with Palestinians, they're not citizens. They're unable to leave, and they're prison walled in for the most part. And well, now they're being bombed and their homes are being taken, their streets are being bulldozed, and nobody see. The only answer is going to be that there's going to have to be some kind of a counterbalance to what the United States and England are funding and are pushing for, and that's going to likely have to come from a Russia, a China, some kind of a Brazil, some kind of a moneyed interest, even Africa, somebody who has the resources to push back on what the West is doing in support of Israel.
Yeah. And speaking on that subject, the recent fall of Syria and the major blow it dealt to the axis of resistance, like it seems to me like Iran is the only major geopolitical power who has any explicit interest in providing the kind of support you've described, but that their avenue to do so has been completely demolished in just the past 2 weeks, it seems to me.
Well, Matt Kennard, mentioned that Iran is next. It was Syria down, Iran is next. And what he was referring to was General Wesley Clark's famous Democracy Now! Conversation. I think it was from like 2004 when he talks about when he worked in the Bush administration, or he was out of the Bush administration. He walked into a room and guys showed him a chart and handed him a list of 7 countries in the Middle East that they had planned to take out. And Iran, it was Lebanon, Syria, Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and they basically have gotten to all of the other ones except for Iran. So it's taken 20 years, but they've achieved. They're getting close to achieving their goal, and I think the goal is balkanizing the entire region to the point where none of them can rise to be a global power.
I agree with your assessment there. And unfortunately, yeah, it does seem like they've had success, like quite a bit success. And we'll have to see what the next year brings as far as Iran is concerned. But I certainly worry that Trump will expand the conflict and make U.S. intervention more of a boots on the ground affair instead of simply funding it. Although I do understand that there are already smaller numbers of boots on the ground.
I think it would have been Harris either way. I think the Democrats are almost happier that it's happening under Trump in a way.
I agree with you there.
Then they can pin it on him. Trump has a son-in-law right now that's selling waterfront property in Gaza, which is beyond disgraceful. And, I can't even, and look, Jared and Ivanka were part of the previous administration. So far, we have not heard of his kids or his family trying to get involved in this new one. We'll see what happens. But certainly his cabinet picks to this date have been the most pro-Israel cabinet that we've seen yet. And they're pro-Zionist. It's, even the Christians, they're trying to put like the Pete Hegseths. He's a Christian Zionist and the Christian warrior. Now, is he going to get the SecDef job? I don't know. I don't think he's qualified at all to run the world's largest office building and one of the world's largest staffs in the world.
Yeah, that sounds difficult, I think, for somebody with not sure about his background, but simply being a news anchor, you wouldn't have the kind of expertise to accomplish that. But you're absolutely right. Yeah. He wants to build the third temple. He wants to help with that. And I don't know if he has any competitors, I guess, for his nomination as Secretary of Defense. But if he gets in there, it certainly does not bode well, I guess.
Yeah, they're gonna nominate him. There's not going to be another competitor yet. If he does not get approved, they will put up another nominee.
Well, we'll see how that goes, I guess. So he's definitely a Christian Zionist, and that seems like it would describe the majority of the cabinet so far. I also just kind of want to ask your opinion about what I'm calling secular Zionists. Like, I'm thinking of Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, members of the New Atheist movement, generally speaking. They're all, it seems to me, uniformly in support of Israel, which I find kind of bizarre given their atheist intellectual commitments. Do you suppose that it's merely Islamophobia that guides them in this direction? Or is there more of a, like the cultural guilt of the West that I mentioned earlier? Or is there another explanation for their own rabid support of Israel despite being these secular types?
I'd say it's both of those things. I would also say that they would point to the technology innovation and what Israel, the thing that you get a lot of the arguments from the Zionist community is, look at all the contributions to the world, all the medical advances, all of the spyware and that technology. But there's a lot more tech that has come out of Israel for the last 20 or 30 years. And then it was, well, the Arabs were there and it was just a pile of sand for 100 years. That's the, this is the argument. And I think that the technologists also believe that the Muslims are not forward thinking when it comes to technology and to that kind of innovation. I disagree. I think that is Islamophobia. I think that's a total stereotype and bias. I think that they're looking at like Wahhabism and the most devout religious people, and if you compared that to the most devout religious Jews, I don't think you see a lot of them that are innovating in computers and in technology either. But I think that part of it also has to do with their paychecks. Sadly enough, they know that if they come out being rabidly anti-Israel, then there may not necessarily be a market for listening to what they have to say.
Mm. Yeah, I think that honestly that might be the fundamental answer in most of those cases. Like I don't I'm not that familiar with these new atheists in terms of their intellectual prowess, but you can't ignore the hypocrisy at a certain point. I find it difficult to imagine that it never became clear to them. So
Well, I think part of it also, it's not with them, but also with the fundamental Christian Zionists, um, is they've got to do these mental gymnastics that allow for the Jews to be in control of Israel no matter what.
Uh, that brings me to something that I wasn't. This was not on my list of things to definitely talk about. But on the subject of Christian Zionists, are you familiar with the Schofield Bible? Have you heard of this?
No.
So this was in the 19th century. I want to say the 1870s. There was a Bible produced called the Schofield Bible by, I believe he was an attorney by trade, maybe out of Louisiana. And it was something that I understand was actually funded by the Rothschild family. And it was a Bible produced with commentary, and the commentary was intended to stir up a kind of Christian Zionism. So that's something that intrigues me anyway, and knowing of the Balfour Declaration being explicitly addressed to Lord Rothschild and so on.
That is interesting. And then you have the Zionist Congress of 1898 as well, that was already talking about putting a Jewish state in Palestine.
Yeah, and that huh. This interests me. You bring up the 1898 conference. I'm familiar with Theodore Herzl, the, let's say, headline Zionist, being an atheist himself. And that intrigues me in terms of what it might say about cultural Jews. Like, are cultural Jews actually more likely to be pro Zionist, given, well, it's hard. I understand the position of the Torah Jews being like, no, this is actually anti-scriptural right now. And so it seems easier for a cultural Jew who happens to be an atheist or otherwise just not very religious, it seems easier for them to ignore that religious hypocrisy or contradiction of scripture. Do you have the same feeling? I mean, we've already discussed like differences between cultural Jews and religious Jews.
Yeah, I would say so. In the way that casual people who watch the news and trust the anchors and the people who deliver the news to tell them the truth and to give them guidance, they're leaning on the religious leaders within the temple to do that. And uniformly, as we discussed, the temple structure around the United States has been pro-Israel. I'm not familiar with a a temple or a group of temples that are explicitly anti-Israel. I think that they would be quickly cast out by the rest of the Jewish community. They would be ostracized very quickly, and they would be called anti-Semitic or self-hating or whatever you want to call it very quickly. And I don't know how long that would survive. Now, some Jews might flock to that and say, you know what, we're not in support of this either. I don't know how many that is even. It's growing here, but are they going to? Then how does the study change? I don't even know because I've never been raised in that kind of an environment. I don't even know how to teach or to study in something like that.
Mm. That at least gives me a little bit of hope in terms of the younger generation of the Jewish community. Like, seems like they will have a harder time simply overlooking the apparent hypocrisy, or even leaving aside like scriptural questions. Just they will have a harder time overlooking how horrible this has all been since last year. I hope
You
so.
know, I showed a video on How Do We Miss That? I don't know, about 4 or 5 weeks ago. Jonathan Cook brought it. I don't know where it came from, but it was basically like looking into the future, 15 years, 2039 or 2040, and all the kids going to a Holocaust museum for the Palestinian people.
Ooh.
around the world. It was powerful as hell. And then they look at their elder, the parent or the grandparent that took them and said, you were there and you did nothing, and every one of they just kind of look down and sad, and they have nothing to say. And it's wow. It's a really powerful 2-minute video that was produced, and it's something that stuck with me for sure.
Jeez, yeah, it's making an impact on me just hearing you talk about it. Like, reminds me, like you said, never again was supposed to mean never again for anybody. It's terrible.
I mean, to see this every day on our timelines, it's like we keep waking up every day, and Reef is my co-host for How Do We Miss That and Boats, and we started INN together. Every morning it's is today going to be the day that we don't see a dead Palestinian kid in our newsfeed? Nope, not today. Mm-hmm. It's every day just a live stream genocide. And I wrote a little bit in the article about how people in our community are literally going through this entire time without ever paying attention to what Israel is doing, to the impact that it's having on the people that they're bombing. They've been focused on the hostages, the hostages, the hostages. It's terrible what they did. They attacked us. They attacked us. They attacked us. Mm-hmm. They deal with the. I haven't heard much about the rapes or the beheaded babies. It seems like those narratives have been debunked quite a bit. Although there is that atrocity porn propaganda movie that Sheryl Sandberg put out. That's a complete fictional narrative that was screened at the White House for Kamala Harris and a group of people in Congress. Anyway, Congress is completely bought into that nonsense narrative. They would all tell you that there were beheaded babies, and that there were babies that were cut out of their mother's stomachs. All this stuff has been debunked. There's been extensive investigations about how Zaka was one of the emergency response organizations in charge. They sensationalized all this, and a lot of the stories that you heard came out of that organization. And every single time it's projection. And that's the other thing that you see so often. And that's the thing that I never hear a member of the Jewish community talking about, acknowledging when a synagogue is attacked, is vandalized, or a business is vandalized. 9 times out of 10, when they do the investigation, it turns out it was another Jewish person that did it to try to create a feeling of terrorism in a way, or a victimhood. And they see it on camera, and there's never a comment. There's never a condemnation. It's just silence and move on, and I can't be part of that. It doesn't compute. It doesn't make any sense. And it's not how I was raised and what I was taught. And so we have to fight that. And this is not why I got into doing this originally. I got into doing this because corporate media was lying mostly about the elections and about our electoral process. And then what you do is you start peeling back the onion, and you realize why they're doing that. And that they're not just lying about that, but then you had COVID, and how much they lied to everyone about all the things during COVID. Mm-hmm. Then you see that they started wars with Russia, and how much they in Ukraine, and how much they lied there narrative wise versus what was coming out of Russia, and as well as in the independent community and in neutral countries, and coming out of countries that had no stake in either side. And it just starts unraveling when you see that it all has a deep-seated connection to Israel.
Jeez, man. This does, the most, I guess, atrocious example of attempts to paint the pro-Palestine protesters as being anti-Semitic. The most atrocious example I've seen recently was in Canada, that I believe she was the owner of a Jewish deli but she put on a keffiyeh and went and started doing Nazi salutes at a protest. Did you see that?
Yes.
God.
Again, 9 times out of 10, it's it's them trying to create a victimhood mentality to reinforce the narrative. It's like that the girl, the other thing were the college campus protests, that today, to this day, I still have people even adjacent. Now it's mostly on the right wing, actually. They're very angry about the way that you know, the way that all went down, and the fact that there were protests on college. It's like, I thought you guys were all for free speech. I mean, these are kids that paid tens of thousands of dollars a year to attend a college. They have dorm rooms, but they want to make a statement and they want to sleep outside in tents, and you got a problem with that? Why?
Gosh, I assume it's just like a law and order sort of thing. Or alternatively, because I've seen this argument myself, or not really argument, but sentiment, they think of those kids as simply woke. Like they think that they have simply fallen for some kind of identity politics psyop rather than being legitimately disgusted with what the state of Israel is doing.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. About those protests being painted as anti-Semitic, I am a little curious if you have noticed at all any increase in anti-Semitism. I'm thinking of, there's one person who I used to follow on Twitter because we do agree on most things, but they did take I'd say a kind of a hard turn towards being anti-Judaism, like suddenly posting some horrible quotes from the Babylonian Talmud or something like that. And it started right after the Chabad Lubavitch tunnels were uncovered in
Yes.
Crown Heights. Yeah. So have you noticed any kind of increase in anti-Semitism in that regard?
Oh, hell yeah. The line has basically been so blurred, but Israel has been the biggest purveyor of creating that narrative, because they have pushed to conflate Judaism and Zionism for decades here. They've literally gotten our Congress and certain states to pass legislation and measures stating exactly that, and that if you state that you are an anti-Zionist, that you are an anti-Semite, which is also crazy because Semites are people that are from a certain region, and guess what? All the Palestinians are also Semites. So if you say you're anti-Semite, all of the language that's being used is manipulated, and it's certainly bothersome to me about how it's been hijacked. But have I seen a rise in anti-Judaism in general and not just anti-Zionism? 100%. A lot of people don't understand the difference. They don't realize that there are people who feel the way that I do, that are Jews, that are vehemently against what Israel is doing, and that realize that they single-handedly are the ones that are making us, the other Jews worldwide, less safe everywhere else. Okay? And honestly, everywhere I've been, that if the minute that you declare, and I don't declare it, and I don't walk around with a yarmulke on, so it's easier to blend in. I've talked with Colin about that it's harder. Like you said, you didn't even realize that I was Jewish. Not that it should matter at all.
Oh God. I think it's disgusting actually to keep track of who's Jewish. Like it's
right.
A thing to do.
So this kid Nick Fuentes that popped up, he had, I think he had done a lot to blur that line. They had blamed Alex Jones, but the more you listen to Alex Jones, the more you realize he was talking about Zionism and the Goyim. And then there's this other thing about Talmudic Jews that really don't believe in necessarily the Torah, but in more the Talmud, which is this other adaptation, which says some pretty vitriolic shit. I have never heard of anyone being a Talmudic Jew in my life, honestly. Nobody really talked about the Talmud or about any of the other ritualistic stuff that he had talked about. That's why people kind of thought he was kind of fringe and crazy. But the longer that this runs, the more you realize that they were just letting out some truths through the crazy in Alex Jones. I think they do that now in other characters in other ops. You know, think about the people who are the most sensational, screaming the most vitriolic shit. A lot of times there's some truth and fact embedded in there that they want to let out. But anytime you mention it, all of a sudden now you're Alex Jones conspiracy level theory stuff, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I believe that that's really, you know, part of the idea of a way to let out some of the most sensitive information that they still want to be able to paint people as outcasts if they believe, even though it's true.
I definitely agree with you. At least as far as Alex Jones is concerned, I have absolutely seen examples of, well, he was 100% right in this particular one instance. It just happens to be blended with 90% crazy stuff. So
yes,
difficult.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, and I think that the manipulation of the media, the portrayal of Muslims and Arabs as poor or evil or you know, behind the times versus talking about, you know, they don't necessarily paint Jews or Israel in that same light, do they? You know, I think it goes really deep, and I think that there are some in this country who have been noticing this for decades, and they were ostracized and painted as anti-Semites. I think a lot of them are feeling a lot of vindication the last few years, seeing that Israel is trying to brazenly get away with wiping out the entire Palestinian population within their country and taking the land, you know, squeezing to the final pieces. And you see those famous maps of Israel and how much they've taken the land from the Palestinian people and how there are just these couple of slivers left. And they're basically gonna now take that too, on which 2 million people live or lived.
Yeah, it's unfortunately shrinking at a rapid rate, and it's hard to get at least the typical Americans to understand that it's about territorial expansion. Like conversations that I've had, it's sometimes the response is, well, why doesn't Egypt let them in, and that sort of thing. It's like it somehow just does not compute that there's any kind of manifest destiny, to use like a very obvious analogy, that there's a different kind of ideology at play than simply Palestinians being bad. It's hard.
No, a lot of it is religious based, a lot of it is land based. And it's been a plan that's been in place since, you know, how long? Hundreds of years, thousands of years. And again, I'm not part of the group that is generationally trying to manipulate the world to make sure that that stays the same way. And
well, I'm happy to hear that. In that case, like I have like one last prepared question for you, which gets back to, what would a just resolution look like to you? Would a one-state solution where there's equal rights between Arabs and Jews, would that be good? A two-state solution? If some kind of space messiah, secular messiah with no religious preferences were to come along and make everything okay, like what would okay look like, I guess?
you know, there are way smarter people than me. I don't believe that a two-state solution is possible or an answer, nor do I think that Israel would allow an equal Palestinian state with equal rights to what Israel has, full sovereignty. And if they're not allowed to raise a military, if they're not allowed to have full water rights, if they're not allowed to have full electricity rights, if they're not allowed to have drilling rights underneath the land and have rights to the oil and gas underneath them and be able to exploit their natural resources without us interfering, maybe, but even still, Israel will just bomb them and take it again. This is a famous story about, like, they asked Palestinian fishermen, like, how come you're not, swimming in fish and you don't have a big business? Well, every time we start to grow, Israel destroys our business. They bomb the business. They bomb the ship. They sabotage this. They try to make sure that they are hindered. And that's not the kind of the world I want to live in. What I do in independent media is I uplift the channels and the people that I think are doing the best work. And I don't talk about the people that aren't doing that work. I try not to, other than to try to expose them and say, hey, these people are not doing it, but these are the people who are. And this is who I want to celebrate and talk about and champion and follow what they're talking about, because this is the truth of what I think. They're closer to being accurate. Nobody's 100% right all the time. But I think the perspective they're coming from is the right one. I think they're coming from more of a world unity type of perspective where everybody gets along, an anti-military perspective where we're not spending $1 trillion a year in resources in destroying people and blowing places up, and maintaining a global structure of 800 bases worldwide that are also used to spy and maintain control in foreign countries. That's all imperialism. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are blind to or happy to be the beneficiaries of the imperialism. They don't want to see how the sausage is made. They just want to see that. They just want the meal.
You're absolutely right. I think just thinking about people I know who would like to think of themselves as more enlightened, but nonetheless, they're getting the paycheck in one way or another. There's sort of the passive beneficiaries of that imperialism.
And they're going to WAPO, and they're going to the New York Times, and they're going to the Wall Street Journal, and they think they're informed. They watch CNBC. They think they're informed. They watch CBS and MSNBC or CNN or Fox News, and they think they're informed.
I know one person in particular actually got vaccine injured, and he is still on the New York Times as the paper of record sort of kick. I think it's his only news source, but it's just ridiculous. Like, how many times do you need to be lied to?
Over and over and over again. It's a brainwashing, and that is the reason why I started to aggregate and amplify independent media in the first place. Is this massive ocean out there of corporate media and narratives and lies that people just swallow whole because they are told to trust the source, and they've trusted that source for decades, and that source is now taking advantage of said trust. The organization has completely morphed into something different than the one that they put their trust in, but it's the name brand.
Well, all right. And on that note, I'm curious, is there anything that you'd like to amplify in particular? Like anything from the independent media that is not just off brand, but doing the right thing? Like in contrast.
I would say the Indie Media Award honorees, that was something that, in order to recognize and acknowledge the top independents that are doing it on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on an annual basis, we want to honor. It's more like a Hall of Fame than anything, because once they're in there, I tend to say that they're a more trusted source. They continuously need to be vetted and screened for that, and it's a tough process. But the Indie Media Awards were created because a lot of people in independent media don't get the recognition, and I do get a lot of questions of, well, if you don't think that corporate media is where it's at, who should we be watching and listening to? And my answer would be the Indie Media Award honorees. I mean, I get a feed through Telegram that I've subscribed to. I get all their RSS feeds and YouTube stuff. So I'm able to kind of get an aggregate view of what's happening based upon a pretty large set of diverse people from diverse backgrounds who all see that imperialism is the problem. And unless you start looking at things through that lens, we're not going to really get very far because everything else is being done in the guise of imperialism and, of course, capitalism and profit. Mm-hmm. So I look for anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, live streamers. I prefer ones that don't take advertising dollars or, that won't promote products, though some still do and have to earn a living. But the ones that are user funded, that don't have to answer to a boss or a corporate structure or an advertiser, are the ones that tend to give you more of the straight scoop because they have no other stake other than getting it right and getting the truth.
Absolutely. It's only been, for me, about 3 or 4 years that I've been paying any attention to independent media, but that is how it was originally sold to me, or rather the friend that sold me on the importance of independent media. That was the point they made that really hit home for me.
So indiemediaawards.substack.com, Substack has been instrumental in the growth of independent media, in the growth of a platform that everyone can kind of come together centrally. WordPress had built something, but it wasn't the kind of community that Substack has built in an email news. They started with email newsletters, and now they've got social media and video and podcasting and a lot more. And I've been along for the ride, as I know you have. So I'm excited to see where it continues to go. I'll continue to grow with it. I've published over 2,000 posts there between INN, Indie Media Today, and helping some of the other channels get started with their posts, and as well as the Indie Media Awards. Each honoree has their own post with all of their links and a Zago Brothers illustration that we commissioned this year.
I love those.
Oh, thank you, man. And me too. I saw what he had done on that poster, and I just thought it was such a cool idea and a great way to honor all of the people in our space, to get them, something that's kind of uniform and universal for all the best of the best of the best. And it's I'm incredibly proud of the Indie Media Awards, of what we put together there, and to be a part of that space that's fighting the corporate machine.
Well, you do a great job, man. Thank you very much. And I'm going to put links to the Indie Media Awards Substack and so on. Just going to load up the show notes with all the appropriate links.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. And I appreciate the invite. And I'm looking forward to you speaking to more of the INN members too. That's going to be a fun series for you to do.
Yeah. Now I'm going to follow up with Colin. So it's going to be great. Thanks, man.
Good stuff, man. All right.